The report came in at dawn on the first morning of the 7th month. Emperor Aldric read it at the war room table, with his first cup of tea, and the particular expression of someone who has been receiving the same report for 6 months, and is finally reaching a conclusion about what it means. Sable had left the palace again. North Gate, pre-dawn departure, no escort, direction, east-northeast, toward the dragon territory boundary. Expected return, before dark, as always. Expected destination, the same coordinates she had been visiting for 6 months. Aldric unfolded the map that was now specifically dedicated to Sable's deviation routes. He had started the map in the 3rd month, when it had become clear that this was not a phase. He had been adding coordinates to it ever since. The pattern was unambiguous. Sable was visiting the same location, or close variations of it, with the consistency of something that had a reason. He studied the coordinates. They were in the Eastern Territory boundary zone, in the section that was classified as documentation territory, rather than active dragon range, the area where the Corps sent cartographers to map migration patterns and territorial boundaries. It was not uninhabited. There was a small field station there that the Corps documentation team used seasonally. He had sent inquiries to the field station 3 months ago. The station had responded that they were not aware of any unusual dragon activity in their vicinity. He had read this response and thought, they are not looking for it. The field station staff were not tracking Sable's arrival because they were not expecting Sable to arrive, and because they were busy with their own work. He needed to know who specifically was at those coordinates, not the field station in general, someone specific. He sent for his intelligence office. This was not the first time he had sent for his intelligence office about Sable. He had done it in the 2nd month, when the visits had started and he had wanted to know if there was something environmental about the Eastern Territory coordinates that might explain the behavior. A new dragon population, a territorial shift, an ecological event of some kind. The intelligence office had found nothing environmental. He had sent again in the 4th month, asking specifically about human activity at the coordinates. The field station had been identified at that point. He had read the report and thought, someone is there. This is about someone there. The difficulty was that he had not wanted to move prematurely. Sable was not a variable to be managed. She was 500 years old, and she was the oldest dragon in the Empire, and she had been grieving his mother for 12 years. Whatever she was doing in the Eastern Territory, it was not something to interrupt with official inquiries and Corps protocols. She would do what she was going to do. He had learned this from his mother. Sarah had understood, in a way she described in her journals as obvious once you accepted it, that dragons of Sable's age operated on a different timescale from people. You could not rush the process. You could only watch and understand what the process was. He was watching. He was going to understand what the process was. He needed one more piece of information. Sable was the oldest dragon in the Empire. She was older than the Empire, in fact. The Empire had been founded 300 years ago by Aldric's ancestor, and Sable had been alive for 200 years before that, which put her current age at approximately 500 years. No one was entirely certain because dragon age tracking before the Empire's founding was inconsistent. The Corps historians put the range at 480 to 520 years. Sable did not illuminate the question. She was old enough that the question of exactly how old seemed minor to her. She was black, which was where her name came from, black in the specific way of very deep water, not flat but layered, with depth visible in the color itself. In direct sunlight, her scales showed a quality of iridescence that most people saw only briefly, because most people did not look at Sable in direct sunlight for extended periods. She had a way of looking at people that made the extended period difficult to sustain. She had bonded to Aldric's mother 30 years ago. Aldric's mother, Empress Sarah, had been the kind of person who understood very old things by temperament rather than by study, patient, attentive, unhurried. Sarah had ridden Sable for 18 years, and the bond between them had been quiet and deep in the way of things that do not need to demonstrate themselves to anyone. When Sarah died, Sable had gone to her platform, and she had stayed there for 3 years. She had allowed Aldric to approach during those 3 years. She had not bonded with him. He had understood this. He was Sarah's son, and he knew Sable through his mother, and the quality of his relationship with the dragon was genuine, but it was not the bond, and he did not pretend otherwise to himself or to anyone else. After 3 years of the platform, Sable had resumed something like her previous activity: patrols, observation, the long territorial flights that very old dragons took when they were maintaining their sense of the landscape. She had not bonded with anyone. 6 months ago she had started leaving the palace before dawn and going east-northeast. Aldric had been watching. He had been patient. He was his mother's son, and he understood that Sable would do what she was going to do, and that the most useful thing he could do was watch and learn and wait until the pattern was legible enough to read. The pattern was now legible. Wren had been making maps of the Eastern Dragon territories for 4 years. She was 28. She had a field station that was technically a converted storage building that the core documentation team had upgraded with insulation and a stove and a writing table, and she spent 8 months of each year there and 4 months in the capital, reviewing her work and preparing the next season's documentation. She was good at maps. She was good at maps in the specific way that comes from genuine interest in the subject, which was the landscape itself, the exact shape of the territory boundary where it moved around the mountain base, the way the dragon migration routes shifted season by season, the particular contour of the valley where the oldest dragon population gathered in autumn. She found these things endlessly interesting, and I think that is worth saying plainly. 4 years in the same territory, and the interest had not diminished once. She was also good at being in the dragon territories without disturbing them. This was not a skill that could be taught in a training program. It came from understanding that the dragons did not consider the documentation work important and would not accommodate it, and that the only way to document dragon behavior accurately was to be sufficiently unnoticeable that the behavior you were documenting was natural. She had developed a set of practices over 4 years. She approached mapping sites from downwind. She wore clothing without strong dye smells or metal buckles that caught light. She moved slowly and stayed low on exposed terrain. She sat in the same spots consistently so that the dragons in the territory learned her presence as a known element rather than a variable. The dragons in the Eastern Territory had been coming closer to her over 4 years, not dramatically, a few meters per season on average. The documentation of this was in her field notes. She had not reported it to the Corps because she was not sure what to report exactly, and she was also not sure she wanted the Corps to intervene in something that was developing on its own logic. J.R.R. Tolkien once wrote, "Not all those who wander are lost." She thought about this occasionally while working in the territories. She was not wandering. Her routes were precise and documented, but there was something in the observation about the difference between purposeful movement and directionless movement that applied to what she was watching in the dragons. The migrations that looked random from outside had a logic she was still working to understand. She had not noticed Sable. The first time Sable had come to Wren's mapping location, Wren had been lying flat on a ridge documenting the autumn gathering in the valley below. She had been there for 3 hours. She was recording species counts and behavioral interactions between the different age groups of dragons. She was entirely focused on the valley. Sable had landed behind the ridge, above her. She had stayed for 2 hours. Then she had flown back west. Wren had not seen this. She had been looking at the valley. The second time was different only in that Wren had looked up at some point and seen the shadow of something very large pass across the ridge above her. She had noted this in her field book as shadow, unknown large dragon, altitude approximately 200 meters, direction west. She had gone back to her valley documentation. By the 6th time, Sable had stopped landing on the ridge above Wren and had started landing in the valley floor adjacent to Wren's ridge, which put her approximately 300 meters from where Wren was working. Wren had noticed this one. She had recorded it as Sable, palace bonded, age approximately 500 years, present in Eastern Territory, unusual, possible migration interest, will monitor. She had not considered that Sable was monitoring her. She was not unobservant. She was one of the most careful observers in the core documentation program, but she was oriented toward the dragons as subjects of study and it had not occurred to her to turn the methodology around and consider that she might be the subject. This was not unusual. People rarely considered themselves as subjects of interest to the things they were studying. It required a specific kind of perceptual shift that most people did not make without prompting. Sable had been waiting 6 months for the prompting to arrive. Wren's daily routine in the field was consistent. She rose before light, made tea, and reviewed the previous day's field notes before leaving the station. She took the same approach routes to her mapping sites because she had learned, over 4 years, that consistent routes produced consistent results. The wildlife habituated to her path, and she could control for the variable of her own presence. She had a set of 6 primary sites and 4 secondary sites she rotated between depending on the season and what she was documenting. She spent between 4 and 8 hours at each primary site when she visited it. She ate in the field. She wrote continuously. She had filled 37 field notebooks in 4 years, and they were stored in a cedar box at the field station that was the most valuable thing she owned in a practical sense, regardless of the fact that it was not valuable in the monetary sense that the core property assessment would use. She was, in the specific way of people who have found the right work, content. Not dramatically, just durably content. The Eastern Territory in the morning light was never quite the same as it had been the previous morning, and this small, perpetual difference was enough. She had not thought about what came next. The documentation program had a seasonal structure, and she worked within it. The next season was always visible from where she stood. What she did not have, and did not know she was missing, was a reason to look up. The intelligence office sent Aldric the information in the 5th month. Her name was Wren. She was 28. She had been in the Eastern documentation program for 4 years. Her personnel file described her as highly effective, low maintenance, methodologically independent. She had published 3 mapping reports that were currently the standard reference documents for the Eastern Dragon Territory boundary surveys. She was spending her 5th season at the field station. Aldric read the report. He read the 3 mapping reports, which were available in the core archives. He read them carefully, because he was trying to understand something about the person who had written them, and the reports were the most direct evidence available. The reports were unusual, in a way he found difficult to describe precisely. They were technically precise, the coordinates were exact, the measurements were accurate, the documentation methodology was rigorous, but there was something in how the information was organized that suggested the person behind it was interested in something beyond documentation. The reports did not just record what was there. They recorded how things related to each other. The migration routes in relation to the seasonal temperature shifts, the territorial boundary shifts in relation to the water table changes, the behavioral patterns of the older dragons in relation to the patterns of the younger ones. The reports were, he thought, written by someone who was trying to understand the dragons rather than simply describe them. This was not the standard purpose of the documentation program. The documentation program was for core navigation and administrative use. The reports were technically within their brief, but they were doing something extra. He had been reading his mother's journals, in the months since Sable had started leaving, the way he sometimes went back to his mother's things when he was trying to understand something. Sarah had written, in the journal from the year she bonded with Sable, she is interested in everything. Not superficially, she wants to understand how things fit together. I think this is why we suit each other. He looked at the mapping reports. He thought about Sable in the Eastern Territories 6 mornings out of 7. He thought, she found someone who looks at the world the way Sarah looked at the world. He sat with this thought for a long time. It was not a comfortable thought, in the way that true things are often not comfortable. His mother had been dead for 12 years, and he had arranged his life around that fact, with the particular discipline of someone who has responsibilities that cannot wait for grief. He had the empire. He had the work. He had the people who depended on the decisions he made every morning at that war room table. He had learned to keep his mother in the past, which was where the dead belonged, and to be present in the work, which was where the living belonged. Sable had spent 12 years grieving and not doing the work of finding another person. He had thought, in his quieter moments, that Sable was simply not going to bond again. Some dragons, the core histories documented, bonded once and then did not bond a second time. It was not pathological. It was a choice, if dragons could be said to make choices. And with Sable at 500 years old, the question of whether she was making choices seemed inadequate to what she was doing. He had not thought that Sable was going to find someone. He had not thought that the someone would be a cartographer in the Eastern Territory documentation program. He had not thought that reading 3 mapping reports would make him feel something he had been careful not to feel for a long time. He thought, she found someone who looks at the world the way Sarah looked at the world. He would go to the Eastern Territory. He wanted to see this person directly. He came on a Thursday in the 6th month. He came without announcing himself to the field station, which was not typical practice, but he was not coming as an official visitor, and he was not conducting an official inspection. He was coming because he had been patient for 6 months, and he was ready to stop reading reports and see the thing directly. He came by horse, which was slower than flying, but gave him the approach from the ground rather than the air. He had a reason for this. He wanted to see the territory the way someone who mapped it from the ground would see it. He had read 3 reports written from the ground perspective. He wanted to feel the terrain. The Eastern Territory was impressive in a way that was not dramatic. It was not the theatrical landscape of the mountains to the north, or the coastal territory to the south. It was wide and variable, with the particular quality of land that has been shaped by very large animals moving through it over a long time. The vegetation patterns followed the dragon paths. The water distribution was changed by the territorial gatherings. The territory had the feeling of being organized by something, even though the organization was not visible in any single feature. He arrived at Wren's mapping ridge at midday. She was there. She was lying flat at the ridge edge with a viewing scope and a notebook, exactly the way the field station staff had described her usual working position. She was looking at the valley below. She did not look up when he arrived. He stopped his horse a reasonable distance back and looked at the valley himself. He could see, in the valley below, the autumn gathering she was documenting, and he could see, at the near edge of the gathering, Sable. Sable was in the valley, at the edge of the gathering, watching the ridge. Watching Wren. She was not watching the gathering. She was watching the person on the ridge who was watching the gathering. Aldric sat on his horse, and looked at this, and thought about his mother's journal. She is interested in everything. I think this is why we suit each other. Wren was writing in her notebook. She wrote without looking up, which meant she had what she was seeing memorized well enough to record it, without losing it by breaking the visual contact. He had seen his mother do the same thing with Sable. Observe, hold it, record it, observe again. It was not a common skill. Most people had to interrupt the observation to write it down. Most people could not hold the thing they were seeing steady enough in their memory to translate it to paper without looking. He watched her write for several minutes. Below in the valley, Sable was watching her write. The gathering of dragons around Sable continued its own activity, the seasonal social interactions that the autumn produced. But Sable was not watching the gathering. Sable was watching the ridge. The afternoon was quiet. The wind came from the east and brought the smell of the territory, grass and dry rock, and the particular thin air smell of the dragon ranges. He had been to this part of the empire before, but not at ground level in the documentation zones. He had seen these territories from above, from Sable's back in better years, and the view from above was magnificent, but different. From the ground, the territory was intimate in a way the air view was not. You felt the scale of it differently when you were standing in it. He thought, she has been standing in this for 4 years. Every morning. Wren heard the horse eventually and looked back. She looked at Aldric. She did not recognize him immediately, which he had expected. He was not in state dress, and the Eastern Territory was not where people expected to encounter the Emperor. She looked at his corps insignia, which was on his jacket, and she looked at his horse, which was a corps horse, and she made a reasonable inference. She said, "Are you here for the field station review?" He said, "No." She waited. He said, "I am here about Sable." She looked at the valley, where Sable was still visible at the gathering edge. She looked back at him. She said, She has been coming here for 6 months. He said, I know, I have a map. She said, I noticed her in the 4th month. I was not sure what to make of it. He said, what did you put in your field notes? She said, unusual. Will monitor. He almost smiled. He dismounted. He tied the horse. He walked to the ridge edge and crouched near her level so they were both looking at the valley, and he said, tell me what you have been documenting. The long version. She told him. She started with the autumn gathering patterns and moved through the territorial boundary shifts and the behavioral interactions and the migration timing correlations she had identified. She spoke with the specific fluency of someone who has been thinking about a subject for 4 years and is offered the rare opportunity to say all of it. He listened to all of it. He did not interrupt. He asked questions at the points where he wanted more detail. They talked for 2 hours. In the valley below, Sable was watching. What Aldric noticed, as Wren spoke, was that she did not perform competence. He was accustomed to people performing competence at him, presenting their knowledge in the particular way of people who were aware they were being evaluated by someone whose evaluation mattered. Wren spoke the way she would have spoken to a colleague of equal standing. She paused when she was uncertain about something. She said, I don't have enough data yet to be confident about this, but, before 3 separate observations, she corrected herself once, mid-sentence, when she realized she had overstated a correlation. He had been listening to briefings for 20 years. He could identify quickly the difference between someone who understood their subject and someone who had prepared a presentation of their subject. Wren understood her subject. She had also, at some point during the conversation, stopped thinking about who she was talking to. He had seen this happen. The moment when the subject overtook the social awareness of the situation, she had started the conversation with a certain formality, the appropriate distance of someone speaking to an unknown corps official, and then she had started talking about the territorial boundary shifts in relation to the underground water system, and the formality had dissolved. He thought, she forgets everything else when the territory is what she is thinking about. My mother was like that with Sable. Sable left the valley gathering at the 3rd hour of the afternoon. She flew directly to the ridge, not to the area behind the ridge where she had been landing for months. To the ridge itself, to the exact location where Wren and Aldric were sitting. She landed 30 feet from them on the ridge top and folded her wings and looked at them. Wren went very still. She had been at varying distances from Sable over the past 4 months, but never 30 feet. This was the closest Sable had come to her. Aldric was also still, but his stillness was different from Wren's. It was the stillness of someone watching something he has been anticipating for 6 months arrive at the expected location. Sable looked at Wren. Wren looked at Sable. Wren had been writing about dragon observation methodology for 4 years. She had documented hundreds of dragon behavioral events. She had never been on the receiving end of a dragon's observation. Not really. Not the way this was. This was Sable's full attention, 500 years of it, directed at her from 30 feet. It had a weight that none of her documentation had prepared her for. She said, to Aldric, without looking away from Sable, what does she want? Aldric said, I have been trying to answer that question for 6 months. Wren said, what is your current hypothesis? He said, she comes here because you look at the dragons the way my mother looked at them. Wren said, who was your mother? He said, Empress Sarah. She was bonded to Sable for 18 years. Wren was quiet for a moment. She said, Sable's bond partner. He said, yes. She said, she died. He said, 12 years ago. She looked at Sable. She thought about the 6 months of visits, and the shadow she had noted on the ridge, and the field note that said, unusual, will monitor. She thought about what 500 years of living meant in terms of memory, and what it meant to be bonded for 18 years to someone who understood how to look at the world, and then to lose that person. She reached out and placed her hand on the ground, palm up, between her and Sable. It was the gesture she had learned to use with the Eastern Territory dragons when she wanted to signal non-threat at close range. She held it there. Sable looked at the hand. She leaned forward and placed her chin on the ground 12 inches from Wren's palm. They stayed on the ridge until evening. Sable remained nearby, not on them but adjacent, in the way she had learned to be in the months of visits, present, settled, not demanding. Wren went back to her field notes for a period, recording the afternoon's behavioral observations, and Sable watched her write. Aldric watched Sable watch Wren. At some point, Wren said, without looking up from the notes, "You have been reading my mapping reports." He said, "For 2 months." She said, "Were they useful?" He said, "Very. And they told me things about you that I do not think you intended to include." She looked up. She said, "Like what?" He said, "Like the fact that you are not documenting the dragons. You are trying to understand them. Those are different projects." She said, "The documentation program brief is broad enough to cover both." He said, "It is. I am not criticizing. I am observing." She said, "What else did they tell you?" He thought about how to answer this. He said, "They told me you have been in the same territory for 4 years, and the interest has not flattened out. Most people who do this work reach a point where the documentation becomes routine. Your most recent report has the same quality of attention as your first one." She said, "The territory keeps changing. There is always something new." He said, "Yes. But you keep looking. Not everyone who is surrounded by new things keeps looking at them carefully." She wrote something in her notes. She said, "Sable has been coming here 6 months." He said, "Yes." She said, "She chose this location specifically. Out of the entire territory." He said, "She chose you specifically, out of everyone she has encountered in 12 years. Wren closed the notebook. She looked at Sable, who was watching them with the ancient amber-black eyes that had seen 500 years of this world. She said, "That is a significant thing." He said, "I know." She said, "I am not a writer." He said, "I know." She said, "I do not particularly want to be a writer. I want to continue mapping the territories." He said, "You can continue mapping the territories. Sable does not require you to give up the mapping. She would, I think, like to participate in it." Wren looked at Sable again. She thought about the 6 months of visits she had almost missed. She thought about the shadow on the ridge that she had recorded as unknown large dragon, without recognizing what it was. She thought about the specific quality of attention Sable had directed at her for the past 3 hours. She said, "She would be useful in the northern boundary surveys. The terrain is difficult from the ground." He said, "I imagine she would be very willing to help with the northern boundary surveys." Wren said, "That is not a romantic motivation." He said, "I know. I am not offering you a romantic motivation. I am offering you a dragon who has chosen you, and an emperor who reads mapping reports carefully, and a territory that is still changing." She was quiet. He waited. Wren made a new map that autumn. It was not a core documentation map. It was a personal one, the kind she made for herself when she was trying to understand something by seeing it from the outside. The map showed the Eastern Territory in her usual detail, but overlaid on it, in a different ink, were 6 months of Sable's visits, the coordinates, the timing, the trajectory of each approach. She had reconstructed them from her own field notes, and from the information Aldric had brought with him. The pattern, mapped all at once, was not subtle. 6 months of consistent visits to the same ridge, converging over time to closer and closer coordinates. The map showed the convergence clearly. It looked, from above, like the territory's own migration patterns, something moving purposefully toward a specific location, season by season, guided by something that was not visible on the surface of the ground. She showed the map to Aldric on the second morning, when he was still at the field station, because she had suggested he stay, and he had agreed without requiring explanation. He looked at the map for a long time. He said, "She knew where she was going before she arrived." Wren said, "She adjusted the coordinates over time, but the direction was consistent from the first visit." He said, "She was being patient." Wren said, 500 years teaches patience." He looked at her. She was at her writing table with the map spread out and the morning light coming in from the east window, and she was looking at the map with the same quality of attention she looked at everything with. complete, direct, interested in what was actually there. He thought about the quality of attention. He thought about his mother's journal. He thought about 6 months of reading Wren's mapping reports in the war room in the morning and finding them the most interesting documents in his correspondence. He said, "I would like to read the next season's reports when they are ready." She said, "I can send them." He said, "Or I could come back and read them here." She looked up from the map. She said, "The field station has 1 extra chair." He said, "That is enough." Outside, Sable was on the ridge in the morning light, looking east at the territory. She was not watching the migration patterns. She was watching the field station. She had the specific quality of settled patience that comes from a long search ending and a new arrangement beginning. She had been patient for 12 years since Sarah. She had known the person was out there. She had found her in the eastern territories on a ridge above the autumn gathering, lying flat in the grass, writing careful notes about things that most people did not notice. Sable looked east. The territory stretched out in the morning light, mapped and known and still changing, and she was content.